Well, welcome again to another session of the State Line Wildlife Zoom series, a cooperative program between Alabama Extension and University of Tennessee Extension. Appreciate y'all joining us to learn a bit more about some questions we commonly get in Extension regarding some turkey populations as we help managers throughout both states. I'm Norm Haley. I'm the Forestry, Wildlife, and Natural Resources agent that serves the northeastern corner of Alabama, and look forward to discussing more on some of these turkey issues that, like I say, we commonly get questions on. As we move forward, I do want to share our NEFA USDA non-discrimination statement. You see the website there. You're welcome to visit the USDA webpage and learn more about our non-discrimination policies. The takeaway from these slides are that we are an equal opportunity institution, educator, employer, and provider. Everybody is welcome at these programs, and this is that same statement in Spanish as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and move into today's presentation. We've got this hot topic of wild turkey mortality. We're going to discuss populations, predation, and also disease. So very often the phone rings or on a site visit, we get questions about why am I seeing perhaps more or less turkey, and then also what can I do to either improve or maintain the flocks that I have. So it's important to understand that, locally and regionally, you'll have highs and lows, and they can depend on many factors, not just what's going on your property, but also, the surrounding land use and what's happening with neighbors. But turkey populations themselves fluctuate between changes in recruitment, potentially as disease might move through, like any other wildlife population. Habitat management changes, not just on your property, but again on neighboring and landscape levels, and also kind of what the harvest has been like over the past few years, and also how the predator populations ebb and flow. So what can you essentially do as a manager? Well, one, it's up to you, and we're glad to help you on the extension side of things too, and other agencies as well, but to try to assess, what your property has or what it doesn't have, and then also what you can do to maintain that habitat. And we'll talk a bit about that and the vegetation that these turkeys so desperately need. And then share this type of information with your neighbors, work along with them and share what's worked for you and what hasn't, and try to improve things, just beyond your property line. So I have habitat management in bold there. I'm a firm believer in properly managing habitat and providing will buffer a lot of these other issues that we're going to talk about today. You may even consider altering turkey harvest, at a smaller scale, even beyond what perhaps state regulations recommend or allow. Of course, managing and assessing the predator population may play a role on some properties. Other land management activities like haying and mowing and the timing of those types of practices can play an important role. We'll talk about that as we go. And especially, in Alabama, we are allowed to feed and bait, and even, there's been concerns about spreading poultry litter and things like that in the name of disease. So these are all things that you can kind of take into consideration and maybe ask yourself as we go through today's presentation. So this is just a very simple population model, kind of how things influence populations, whether it's turkey or otherwise. But of course, mortality is what we don't want to see necessarily outside of our own hands during a regulated hunting season, where we'll lose birds. But then also through all types of other mortality that we'll talk about today. Immigration is those that move into the population. Emigration is those that walk away, and recruitment, which we'll harp on quite a bit, is those that are reproduced and join the population as reproducing adults. So with turkeys, it's important to understand they're short-lived. Males are really only on the landscape on an average for 2 years. That's primarily on account of the hunting that we do for those males during the spring season and fall season in some cases, while females really only live just about an average of 3 years. There are some that do get older and last a while, but turkeys have a hard time. There's a lot of things that like to make use of turkeys as food, lots of predation and mortality going on, and we'll talk about that as we go. But essentially, if a hen is able to replace herself and the tom that she's bred with, then she's really kind of done her job. The population will be stable. Of course, we'd like to see and maintain even a little bit of population growth as we manage our birds, and a lot of folks I'd argue, would like to see more turkeys. I don't think I've ever run into a client that needs to see less, hardly. So On the recreational side of things, more turkeys is a better thing. So some of these individual mortality sources that influence the population, predation can be a big one, and we're going to talk about that as we go. Our harvest, both legal and also illegally, as far as poaching is concerned, can be a driver. Virus and disease has a bit more of a microscope on it nowadays. We'll discuss that. And again, like I referenced earlier, some of our land management practices themselves can also influence individual mortality. All right, how about recruitment loss? What are some of those drivers for that population influence? Well, we can have nest failure. Of course, predators play a role there. Some hens are infertile. You also see hen abandonment for one reason or another, disturbance, and or perhaps just poor motherhood just gets up and walks away. That's not something that's out of the realm of possibility. And of course, nest failure, again, going back to some of our land practices, and you see prescribed fire showing up there too. We'll talk about that in a few slides later on. And poult mortality is another big driver. Of course, we have predators that feed on young turkey poults as they're up and hatched and walking around. They can be susceptible. Starvation is another factor to consider. Exposure and weather impacts on those young poults. They can be very susceptible to poor weather, rain and cold primarily, and then also even the potential for disease and birth defects. So some of these we can control and others we can't, but we're going to talk about the controllables today. So a major concern, kind of going back to that poult mortality and recruitment and things like that, is these poult to hen ratios that we're seeing essentially on decline, not throughout just the Southeast, but throughout a large portion of the U.S. Many folks and agencies are documenting a poor poult to hen ratio, or at least decreasing. So again, 2 poults per hen is fair. That's going to be that parental replacement I referenced earlier. But if we have more than 3, that's good. 4 is considered excellent. So you can see here, this is a plot for Alabama on their brood survey. And I've got data here from 2010 all the way through 2020. We are seeing our poult to hen ratio decline between that parental replacement of 2. And that is a concern. And you can see that bolded or there, but that bold oval there, those years that we are at the below 2 threshold. That's a bit of a cause for an alarm. Tennessee has also seen declining trends in their poult to hen ratio. This data is from 2003 to 2023. And Georgia's really no different. They're seeing declines as well. So it's not just an Alabama or Tennessee or Georgia or a Southeastern problem. Again, this is a trend that we're seeing really throughout the wild turkeys range. So when it comes to habitat, I know this isn't a habitat presentation, but I can't help it. I have to harp on it at least a little bit here. What are some of the limiting factors for wild turkey? Very often when we step onto a property and visit clients, or even as you perhaps visit some of your public lands, what's limiting? It's primarily going to be nesting cover. That's protection for those nesting hens and their eggs from both that predation and weather that I referenced earlier. And then also brooding cover is a limiting factor. That's protection for the hens and her poults now from predation and weather. And brooding cover, another important factor to that is the food production, primarily those forbs or just broadleaf flowering plants that attract insects. That is an important component of a poult diet that we'll talk a bit more on as well. So I'm I think it's pretty fair to state that there's not many things that are going to buffer mortality better than quality habitat management. That is certainly step number one. And then, further on down the line, once the habitat is in place and we do decide that we've got sufficient nesting and brooding cover, well, then a predator control program may help to bolster populations further and maintain and grow turkey populations. But habitat management is far and away one of the first steps we need to look at when we talk about turkey numbers and building flocks and viewing turkeys and having quality hunting experiences. So with this picture here, I've got this hen on a nest and already kind of a peekaboo there of a gray fox. But when we look at this nesting hen, she's not in very good cover, which we're going to describe here in a moment. What is she susceptible to? Well, not just to that gray fox or mammalian predators, but also avian predators as well. Gray fox, coyote, and bobcats are all very hard on a nesting hen, as can be some of the larger avian predators. You can see hen mortality come through predation at that point. And then, of course, what happens when that hen is off the nest and she's been predated? Well, then there's a very good chance for complete nest failure, of course, as other predators come through. She's not there any longer to go ahead and incubate those eggs. They're going to fail anyway, and then the nest predators come along and raid that nest, like you see the raccoon there in the bottom center. So again, we got the peekaboo of a gray fox. My animations aren't quite right here, but you look at that brood of poults there that was easily found to take this picture in a wide open pine stand. Not much else there besides the pine needles and the little bit of looks like desmodium they're huddled around. What are some of their predatory concerns or factors that we're going to consider as managers? Avian predators, of course, are very hard on young poults, especially if they're out and susceptible, don't have proper cover to avoid that avian predation, that overhead cover and escape cover. But then also mammalian predators as well, bobcats. As you can imagine, the feline is one that loves to chase down birds, whether it's turkey poults, songbirds, or otherwise. They're also a major contributor to poult mortality, along with the avian predators and gray fox. So, okay, what is some of the ecology behind nesting that's important to consider as a turkey manager? Well, they're primarily nesting from April to June. Those hens are on the nest for about a 26-day period. Only about half of those nests are successful, and we've even seen lower success rates than that in some studies that we've got to reference. And about 30 to 60 some percent of those hens may re-nest for a second, and they'll even go on for a third nesting attempt if those first two attempts fail at times. The peak hatch is primarily around the first week of June. Now, what is nesting cover? You, it's it's kind of variable, but you can think about it as primarily being waist to chest high vegetation with some sort of adjacent structure, kind of an overhead or horizontal cover, very often next to a shrubby component or a stump or a tree, a down log, something along those lines. And I've got a picture here of a clear cut. It looks to be in about its second year of advancement, maybe even third. That would be an example of a visual of a potential nesting cover there along that more mature hardwood forest that you see there in the background. Your hens would choose to nest in that clear cut long before a closed canopy hardwood stand. All right, how about a bit on poult ecology? Well, once they hatch, they are up and immediately leaving the nest and following mom to the brooding area. At 7 to 10 days, they're able to kind of up and fly low, kind of what you might picture as a quail. They are able to fly for short distances to avoid predation. A big benchmark is at 14 days, they're able to up and fly and roost in trees. That is like I say, a milestone, if you will, for poult advancement and potential survival in the long run. If we can get them to a 14-day age, they've got a really good chance to make it. They do require, you see there in bold, that 80% insect diet at a young age, and that's because of the protein that they require to rapidly grow and hopefully down the line recruit to the population. At about 4 weeks old, they are able to have a bit of a diet shift to green vegetation. And here's the bad part about poult ecology: 50% we see, time and time again, dying somewhere between that week 1 to 6. That can be starvation. They're not finding those insects they need, exposure to the weather, and of course, predation that we've already referenced. So what is brooding cover? What's going to provide that insects and that cover for predation and that respite from exposure? It's primarily early grasses and forbs that are going to be about a knee to waist high. And again, there's some variability in there, but that's kind of what you can picture it as. And it's important that brooding cover is in pretty darn close proximity to nesting cover. You can see in that lower right picture that hen is having to lead her brood across a wide open hayfield to go to some suitable brooding cover that she otherwise doesn't have close by. Those poults, for example, in that photo are very open to predation at that point. And in our brooding cover, we do kind of see them primarily these hens leading their poults to these areas in that knee to waist high height because it's high enough that will provide that overhead cover and escape for predation for those poults, but also it's low enough that it allows her to see, oncoming danger and move her brood to safer grounds, alert them and move them off. But it's also important that it has to be open enough at the ground level to where that young turkey poult is able to navigate and traverse that terrain and capture insects and also dash into the cover to escape predation and not be bound up in a thick vegetation at ground level that hampers their mobility. So there's some caveats that go into brooding cover, that it's not just that height that we're talking about. You have to have an openness at ground level as well. So where can we find or potentially create and maintain nesting and brooding cover? That again, being early grasses, forbs, and shrubby component is great as well. Well, nesting cover again has that height of 24 to 48 inches. We primarily see that in a 2 to 4 year old vegetation. So that would be termed as an early successional stage. And 2 to 4 years can seem like a wide range. That can depend on the productivity of a site, the vegetation that you have, that plant community. It might even depend on the weather patterns for that year. So we don't get stuck on a hard and fast rotation, if you will, on some of these cover managements, but roughly in a 2 to 4 year old return interval, that young vegetation is what we're seeing as deemed as nesting cover. Brooding cover, again, that shorter height, 12 to 28 inches, is on a shorter rotation. It's younger vegetation in just a 1 to 3 year old time frame because, again, it's that lower height. So where do we find these? Field to forest transitions, clear cuts, forest openings, daylit roads, power lines. The list goes on there. But all of these are examples of where you could potentially look to maintain or even aim at creating both that nesting and brooding cover. And Dr. Craig Harper at University of Tennessee Extension has an excellent video that visually describes what these covers look like, especially nesting cover in this video, but there's also nods to brooding as well, that far and away better describes what I can do here in just this hour presentation. So I greatly recommend you head to your search engine online, type in the title that you see in this video here, and take time to view that. I think it does a phenomenal job at describing the vegetation types that I'm trying to here just by PowerPoint slide. And speaking of Craig Harper and Dr. Harper in the University of Tennessee, and also Dr. Dave Bueller, they had put together a Tennessee Cooperative Wild Turkey Project in terms of some of the research that they've done there. I wanted to share this with you as well. They monitored 432 hens over 6 to 7 years, actually goes into 2023. But these are some super important messages that come from this research. They found that 46% of hens in Middle Tennessee selected to nest in early succession or young forest, that vegetation type that we just described for nesting cover. However, that habitat, that cover only comprised of 7% of the landscape. That vegetation is almost unavailable to them in many areas. So it's also important to know that 36% nest success was seen in these early succession and young forests, which was better than any other type of plant community that they monitored and found nesting hens in. Also important to note here too that hens with broods often had to travel over a mile from the nesting cover to the brooding cover. So again, important to keep these in close proximity so that we don't necessarily have to have that hen lead her poults on, what's essentially a death march and get predated all along the way from the nest site to the brooding site. Annual nest success was less than 30% over the course of this study. Like I say, earlier on, we usually would often see nest success in that 50% range. But again, if 7% of the landscape is in suitable nesting cover, you can see why that nest success rate was so low in this study. The 28-day poult survival was also low. Again, if you have to travel your poults a mile, you're going to be in trouble as a mother and as a poult, of course. Annual hen survival was around 50%. The take home from this is just that, and this is the quote from the summary of the study, is that improved habitat management with some level of predator control is likely required to increase turkey numbers on most properties. So overall, what's the beyond just nesting and brooding, what vegetation do we need for self-sustaining populations? Of course, area display areas for males to be seen. That's part of the reproductive process. We don't lack that on the landscape. We have plenty of options for display, as you can see the examples listed there. Roosting is also incredibly important, but we do maintain a lot of mature woodlands throughout the Southeast now. Again, not a limiting factor. The limiting factors are bolded there in red, and we've already harped on those early successional areas for reproduction, being that nesting and brooding cover, and also foraging in the spring and summer, especially for those poults like we referenced, brooding areas that provide invertebrates, green browse, and seed and soft mass production. And in the fall and winter, turkeys rely heavily on woodlands and old egg fields and some of our supplemental plantings and food plots as well. And again, are those are not often found to be limiting throughout the Southeast. But in Alabama's case, there's kind of a good reference here that about 640 acres of good habitat, that's not marginal and that's not excellent, just good middle of the road habitat, supports about a 20 to 30 bird flock in general. So the next question is well, how much of this vegetation and landscape do I need to maintain in X, Y, or Z? So again, it's very hard to put firm numbers when we talk about landscape level management and wildlife management together. But just to give a rough idea here, I like to put these slides up. So generally, we see forests maintain on about 60 to 75% of the land area, and of course, the forest is providing that hard and soft mass. That display area that we talked about in that matrix, the fall and winter food resources as well. And if that forest is managed, it could potentially also provide nesting and brooding areas. We'll talk about that a little bit too. So when I say 60 to 75% forest, I'm not referencing a closed canopy forest. Productive forest for in terms of wildlife and potentially even timber production benefit from having at least a 30% open canopy. That's what's allowing that sunlight to reach the forest floor and provide some of these other vegetations, food types, and covers that not just wild turkey, but lots of other wildlife benefit from as well. So they need disturbance in order to be, number one, to create these, but then also maintain that wildlife value. So that disturbance is primarily through the management that we see over here on the right hand side. In pines, will thin, patch clear cuts are excellent, and a term known as QVM or quality vegetation management. That's primarily herbicides to control unwanted understory vegetation and also prescribed fire, maintains a productive pine woodland. In hardwoods, half-acre patch openings are excellent. Of course, you can do mid-story and undesirable removals and shelter wood cuts as well. Those are all ways to not only generate revenue potentially from a timber harvest, but also spur on that wildlife value as well by allowing that open canopy and that sunlight. There's also a term out there as FSI, that's forest stand improvement. That's primarily in terms of crop tree release. That's releasing those productive oaks and mass producers, and also controlling invasive and reducing low value species as well. And of course, prescribed fire has a place in both pines and hardwoods and is very beneficial towards our wildlife populations as well. It's ideal if we can alternate those blocks, those burn units on a 1 to 4 year rotation. And again, that's to maintain that brooding and nesting cover that I just referenced was so limiting. And we can also vary the seasonality of fire, and that being cool season fire, warm season fire, some variability in intensity as well, backing and head fires, strip fires, and things like that. We don't want to get stuck on the same fire return interval or intensity, or we don't see the variability and value that we would if we varied those applications. And it's important to know that yes, upland hardwoods are burnable. It takes more care, but we can put fire in hardwoods as well. All right, how about openings? This is one of those things that is limiting on the vast majority of properties that I get to visit throughout my region. We recommend they're maintained on a 5 to 25% scope of the land area, and openings are not what I'm referring to as food plots. Food plots are we really only recommend at a 1 to 5% of the overall land composition. Food plots are expensive, high input. They take a lot of time and effort, and we can foster a lot of other wildlife values in terms of cover and nutrition by managing the native plants through these openings I'm about to describe. So when we're managing for these native plants, that's giving not just plant diversity in terms of species, but it's also providing the cover and nutrition, that being primarily forbs and soft mast and insects that some of our planted crops, like our food plot varieties, don't. So again, when I'm talking about openings, I'm not referencing necessarily pasture or hayfield. That's just because these warm and cool season perennial or even annual grasses that are intended for livestock consumption, they're not valuable or have very minimal value for wildlife. We can do better managing a native plant community. So old fields and clearings are a good example of some of these openings. Ideally, again, we're burning these. You do have an option to disc to alter those plant communities, provide that disturbance, and also maintain them through herbicide applications as well, or even convert them from old pasture or hayfield to a native stand through herbicides. And also, invasive species are prevalent no matter how well we manage an area. Very often you've got to spot spray and manage invasives through herbicide applications. We're not talking about mowing these areas. As we mow, we get a lot of woody resprouts that don't benefit the nesting and brooding that I've referenced. It also creates a thatch layer, fosters invasives, makes it difficult for pulp mobility, and just reduces the value of these openings. So we don't recommend mowing them. And again, control any forage grasses with herbicide and invasives and things like that. That is important. You can incorporate openings in areas like power lines, your logging decks, fire breaks. You can daylight your roads. Do cleared forest patches is another good way to incorporate those. And instead of regenerating that into forest or replanting, you just maintain them as wildlife openings. And again, ideally if they're burned. But food plots do have their place. You can see that there's a list there of those that are commonly planted in the name of both turkey and deer, and those are best suited for places that you can work and easily access and maintain with a relatively low effort. I guess I could say so. Pick your best high productivity sites, flat ground, easy to manage for your plantings. But essentially, in these openings, the goal is a forb-dominated site. Again, that's just broadleaf flowering plants, and with only about 30% grass. We don't want to get carried away with the grass component here. Grass primarily just provides a little bit of structure, a little bit of uh, nesting cover in some cases, a little bit of nest material in the name of quail and things like that, but it's really primarily there to help carry a fire through a stand and help maintain that area as a natural opening. So when we talk about the overall land management and you're kind of picturing that composition, it's essentially the more that you can look at a property in a diverse landscape like you see pictured here, from early succession to closed canopy hardwoods and thinned and open hardwoods and open areas for display, clear cut areas, feathered field edges, perhaps a variety of pine in some cases, whether it be shortleaf and loblolly, or lower in my state we were able to get away with some really nice stands of longleaf pine. That's not the case in Tennessee, but a diversity is important. And very often when we're visiting a site, it starts with a timber harvest. Again, a lot of our clients end up beginning their wildlife management goals and maintaining them through timber harvest. Again, closed canopies are a tough thing to manage around, have very limited wildlife value throughout the majority of the year. And then it's maintained through disturbance, like I referenced earlier, that being prescribed fire, the herbicide applications, and also through timely disking as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some predators and predator management and the roles that they might play towards influencing wild turkey populations. So with predation, there's three primary ways to look at it. It's nest predation, pulp predation, and then also predation on the adults themselves. And now in this top list here, you see the top offenders, if you will, for the mortality agents as far as predators are concerned. And I just like to point out that those in red are things that we can't necessarily limit or take through regulated harvest and things like that. Now we can potentially influence, keeping feral dogs and cats to a minimum, taking care of our pets, but things like snakes and our avian predators are difficult to manage because there's not very many other options other than providing quality cover that provides escape and protection for the game we're trying to manage, in this case, the turkey. So it's important to know that predator management, it takes some considerations, right? So predators may or may not be a limiting factor on your property. Turkeys have evolved with predation. That's why they all nest at one time. That's why they all have hen or nests full of 8 to 11 eggs. They produce a lot of poults at one time. They've evolved to deal with some predation. They essentially expect to not raise every single one of their poults. So that's a consideration too. They have a lot of predator defenses. They can see, they can hear, they can fly, they can run. They're built to deal with some predation. And it may do more harm than good if you do predator control, trapping, and removals on a small or on a temporary scale. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But there is a potential, and there's been some research that short term but consistent year in and year out focused predator control may do well. That's an example of, I've got there of trapping raccoon and possum and coyote prior to the nesting season. Just a few months prior, reduce their numbers, get them off the landscape in the short term, allow those nests to hen, or allow those hens to nest and those broods to get up and again try to reach that 14-day threshold of roosting in the trees. That is legal now in Alabama. One thing important to note, that what's legal in one state as far as trapping and season and equipment and things like that, it can be very different from between Alabama and Tennessee. And it's very important to keep up with those regulations. Not everything I say here is going to be on the up and up in Tennessee. So I do give an Alabama-based presentation. So keep that in mind. Make sure that you are following your trapping laws. Also important to know that some edge and some arrangement can actually increase predator success. That's another thing to consider too, the layout of the property. Very small patches of nesting cover make it very easy for predators to go ahead and hunt that area and move on to the next. Very long linear edges can potentially be a problem as well. So some of that juxtaposition and management and some of those acreages might be a consideration. And again, I've already said this, but habitat comes first and then comes predator management secondarily. You got to have the habitat really before you dive into predator management. So let's just throw up some numbers quick here too and try to get a rough idea of what the literature is showing us as far as predation is concerned. So this is a study, and this is a South Dakota study. I know we're in the Southeast, but I still think that the take home here applies that, when we talk about the predation on adult female, adult hens, the vast majority of it is taking place, as you see there, in the springtime. 63% of the hen mortality in this study took place as they were on the nests or when they were brooding. So this is a time of year where that nesting and brooding cover really kind of hits home, because that's when these hens see a lot of mortality. And reproducing adult hens are extremely important to a turkey population. Losing adult hens and having a 63% hen mortality can be a substantial impact towards the long-term trends of a wild turkey population. So you want to keep your hens alive. Here is a study that took place in North Alabama, looking at poult predation. This was on a wildlife management area in the northern part of the state, and just the take home from this is that 42% of those known poult deaths were caused by mammalian predation. 16% was by avian, and of that, 95% of these poults, 95% of the mortality took place within the first 15 days. Which again is a stressor to the factor that if we can get them to 2 weeks of age and up and roosting in trees, they can be in pretty good shape. Of the mammalian predators, I broke it out here. 18% of that was by feral dog, 7% raccoon, 5% gray fox, and 0.7 as bobcat predation. Here was another one that took place in the coastal plain, further off into northern Florida and Georgia, by many of the same authors, and you can see the variability here in the predation. So I put these two up just to show that um, uh, predation and the impacts can vary based on location. But again, 96% of the mortality took place in the first 15 days. That was consistent among studies. But this time, again, the mammalian predation changed a bit, with 71% being the cause of mortality for these poults versus the 13% for the avian predation. Even have three alligator predations in here as well, being more on that coastal plain area. But 29% of that mammalian predation took place by raccoons, 20% by bobcat, 12% by gray fox, and 5% coyote. So, as you begin to reflect on your own property and your own turkey population and the predators that you've seen, it's important to kind of start asking yourself some question here. Is one, you've got to determine if you, or maybe even your region, potentially has a predator problem, and usually that's going to take some data. Um, you may have some data. We'll talk about some ways to gather that here in just a moment. But look at what the data is telling you. Is your turkey population in decline? Do you have a predator problem? Maybe you have a habitat problem. Maybe we can improve that. Maybe you've also seen some sick turkeys. That could also be a reason that we might be blaming predators for decreasing turkey populations, but perhaps you've got some disease and viral issues going on. And also, what are your neighbors doing? What's their habitat? What's their harvest regime like? What's going on across property lines can play a role as well. So when we talk about population estimates, and this can also go back at the same time to kind of assess the predator population, at least um, um, a little bit haphazardly, but at least provides some data. In the research and in academia, we do mark and recapture and recite methods. That's not something that's very realistic for the private landowner. They'll also do radio and GPS tracking on these animals. That's how we see some of this data coming out of these studies. But what can we do as a private landowner or manager? Hunter harvest and observation surveys can be something to at least provide some baseline, year in and year out. If you're going to go ahead and record what you've seen in the field that day, and also what you've harvested year in and year out, that can be very valuable. There are some free apps online. Mississippi State Deer Lab has a way to record observational studies with their free app, as you see in that icon there in the lower central part of this slide. That can be a good way to make it easier for you and your hunters to track data, not make it so much work on yourselves. Gobble counts are another way that you can go ahead and survey the population. This is something that is also done in the literature as well. Of course, as you observe turkeys and then also record more gobbling, as those ebb and flow, of course, more gobbles is a positive. That's more turkeys, right? And then trail cameras can play a really nice role. Some brood surveys to see how many poults you have per hen, how many lone hens you have, and also gathering predator data at this time as well. And also, in other presentations, I talk about deer camera surveys. As you're doing a deer camera survey, go ahead and record the turkeys that you see in that early summer and late winter. Also record the predators that you're seeing, and over time, you may be able to track trends and ebbs and flows in all of these data types that we just discussed. Looking further on, as far as hen survival, or gobbler and hen survival too, as far as predation is concerned, when we talk about the differences here, one more thing I wanted to tease apart before we go into some of these other predator controls, but gobbler survival can be very different from hen survival, and the mortality agents can be very different as well. So gobbler survival varies annually on this WMA, anywhere between 39 and 54%. 91% of the mortality is during the spring season, though. So we as hunters are the responsible for far and away the lion's share of gobbler mortality. Or during the spring season is when they see the majority of the mortality, but 78% of that was from reported harvest. A large amount goes off the end of a shotgun for that spring season. And jakes and gobblers both had similar survival in this study. So in this case, for gobbler survival, predation wasn't so important. It was harvest and hunter management that was important in this case, but very different over here for hen survival. They average about 51% annual survival for this study. 95% of hen mortality was caused by predation. Again, because in Mississippi, the take of hens in that spring season is not permitted, so that predation all goes towards, or that mortality all goes to predation. And 69% of that was seen during the nesting and brood rearing time frame, very similar to those previous studies that I just shared. In this case, accidental harvest was low, so hunter take wasn't an issue. Predation was, of course, the important factor. They also questioned in this study about the incubation status of these hens, and then also if there was poaching going on. In future studies, they found that poaching was about 10% of that hen mortality. But in that future study, they found that only 46% of hen mortality was caused by predation. Why was there such a big change from 95 to 46%? There were major habitat improvements made between these studies on this WMA. Timber harvest, prescribed burning, all the management that we've highlighted earlier began to take place, and you nearly saw that hen mortality cut in half because of the vegetation and land management and timber management that was taking place on that site. This is a very good commercial for what habitat improvement can provide. So when we talk about some of the other considerations, or to kind of put some numbers behind some of these considerations for predator removal, and kind of what does it really take to impact the game populations. Well, coyote require at least a 35% reduction in population to see game trends trend up and translate from that removal and to increase game populations. So that's a lot of coyote harvest that can be difficult to maintain by the general landowner. But it's a very legitimate tool to go ahead and go through a predator management, a trapping program, if you will, but it's rarely recommended. So why is that? If it's a legitimate management tool and it works, why is it rarely recommended? Well, it's very often not practical for most properties or landowners. The logistics and scale are a major problem, a major limiting factor for us as land managers. Some properties are very, very large, potentially hard to access and hard to deal with, get the traps out there set enough as just a landowner and the manager or the hunting lease or whatever it may be. The workload is difficult to maintain on a large scale like that. Or potentially the property is too small to actually trap and have a legitimate impact as well. So very often it's going to require cooperation among, many staff or helpers or adjoining landowners to potentially incorporate thousands of acres of trapping shared among multiple hands. And why does it take, or why was I referencing a tract being too small, or why do we need to incorporate thousands of acres? It primarily goes back to the home range of these species we're trying to control and reduce. If you look there, a possum can average 250 acres of range. A raccoon has a surprisingly large range of 800 acres at times, and coyotes and bobcats are just tremendous roamers. At 6,000 acres, you can see to where if you're trying to really impact and reduce that 35% coyote population, you got to have help and and cooperation with neighboring properties to incorporate the home range of some of these species. So the other issue too is trapping comes with a learning curve, right? You have to be trained up on the proper techniques. It's very easy to educate your predators and be very ineffective at trapping if you don't learn all the caveats and tips and tricks and techniques towards effective trapping. It also takes time to learn, reduce that learning curve. You got to spend some time learning from others, or doing a whole lot of research and watching videos and training yourself up. It takes time to prep that equipment. It takes time, of course, to make those sets, and very importantly, checking traps, ideally every morning. Legally, you have to check land sets once every 24 hours. So you can imagine having another full-time job outside of just land management. That can be a very large burden and just logistically difficult. And of course, the money and economical input as well, the gas and the equipment, and potentially even hiring trappers. It all comes at an expense. So the other important thing to consider too is that once you start trapping, you need to be very consistent about it, primarily through the term here in the lower right, known as compensatory reproduction. In a low intensity removal, where you're not removing a tremendous amount of predators. In the case of coyote here, they average about 3.5 pups per litter. If you're intensively removing coyotes off a property, those that remain end up with higher litters. You see there at 6.3 per litter. And what that is as more resources become available, and those coyotes that remain are healthier and have access to better resources, they put more pups on the ground. So you can imagine in a situation where you've done an intensive removal and then stopped for a few years, you could potentially end up with more coyotes than you started with. So consistently trapping year in and year out once you've started is important because of that compensatory reproduction. But seasonal and time trapping may work for you and your neighbors and your surrounding properties and for your workload and staff and time and whatever it may be. It's going to be an individual basis, but seasonal and time trapping does have its utility. So when we intensively trap before and also ongoing throughout the nesting season, which for Alabama, we peak around the second week of April, we can have some impacts. So the other consideration too is the fur bearer season. We are unable to trap bobcat and skunk and fox outside of the fur bearer season. And we saw the impact that bobcat and gray fox can have on both nesting hens and the poults as well. So you're limited there just by the fur bearer regulation that we have in Alabama. But we do have open trapping for coyote, possum, and raccoon in this state. So that is an opportunity to at least target those nest predators. So the concept of this is just to give those hens and those poults enough time for the hens to incubate and hatch out the poults, and those 4 weeks to get those poults shifted over to that green vegetation, or even less, that 2 week to get them up in trees. So with this intensive trapping, sometimes you might consider hiring someone or involving neighbors again to try to get as many off locally as you can. And you got to do it annually. I've already referenced that. It's ideal if we can start putting traps in the ground 3 to 6 months prior to nesting and ongoing throughout that season. And it's important to note that predators immigrate into new territories very quickly. They, as they roam around those large acreages that I referenced earlier, they will find areas that are essentially, vacant, uncolonized, recognize that as a new territory and move in. So there's always an immigration of new predation or new predators on the landscape. That's why it has to be done annually. Um, and results are going to vary by property and by trapper. Some properties trap very nicely. Some properties are difficult to trap. It also is based on your experience and just how much you're going to put into it, how many traps you're going to put in the ground, just how efficient you can be in that short time period. And I like to joke on myself all the time. I'm not a very efficient trapper, but I'm an effective trapper. I'll get what I'm after eventually. But in the case of a timed removal, I certainly wouldn't be hiring someone with my experience and techniques to get in there and quickly remove these predators off the landscape. I don't come with that skill set. It takes a lot of learning and a lot of time in the field to be an efficient trapper. There's also seasonal considerations. This is an example of coyote biology. In February to March, which is a great time for what I just referenced in terms of the time trapping. That's when they're in their breeding period. Food is fairly scarce, and these animals are highly mobile. So February to March is a great time frame to try to trap and target coyote. One that wouldn't be would be May to July when they're denning. Small home ranges at that time. Food is abundant. Spring has sprung. There's lots of animals roaming around, lots of animals hatching out. So their home ranges shrink. So it's going to be more difficult to trap coyotes during that time period. And then versus September to November, that's highlighted in green again. They're in their dispersal period. That's when the young are off and leaving to establish new territories, and again are very susceptible to being trapped. So that the animal biology and ecology can play an important role in trapping timing as well. So you got to know and research a little bit about what you're trying to trap. And there is a wild card of predators. You saw earlier on that slide just how significant feral dog predation was for the North Alabama mortality study. Feral dogs can have a significant impact. And at a minimum, it's just disturbance and stress on that wildlife. And of course, mortality is the major downside of having these feral animals. So, keep your pets up, speak with neighbors, keep this in mind as you go forward with or just consider turkey populations and their stewardship. Keep your animals penned up and talk with neighbors and reduce that as much as possible. They can be impactful. But let's say we've decided to trap. Well, I've already referenced, make sure you read your state's trapping regulations annually. They do change and ebb and flow. So make sure that you understand the trapping dates, the species you're legal to trap, and the equipment that you're allowed to trap with. You see some of those dates over here by species for Alabama, and also consider some of those logistics as you decide to trap as well, and incorporate as many hands on deck as you can. We talk about raccoons and possums. Again, there's an open season in the state of Alabama, very commonly trapped with number 1 to number 1.5 foothold traps. We can very easily bait live traps as well with very common bait types that you could imagine for these omnivores, things like just shelled corn, that can of sardines, dog and cat food. Um, Sprinkle it with fish oil as well. I'm a big fan of fish oil when it comes to raccoons, and marshmallows mashed beneath the live trap as you stake it down to where they've got to fight and dig and ultimately step on that trap pan's a good trick. And DP raccoon traps are a really good option as well. Very selective trap, specifically if you've got other non-targets around, like potentially dogs and cats. That's a very good way to keep them from being trapped. DP raccoon traps can also be effective at trapping possums, but not nearly as effective as they are at specializing towards raccoon. Coyotes open season as well. A number 2 to number 4 foothold does well. All types of sets for coyotes. There is a steep learning curve. Lots of folks like to start off trapping coyotes. That is a very intelligent, difficult to trap animal to start off with. So make sure that you've done some homework and studied some resources to make sure you don't educate them off the bat. Educated coyotes are a tough one to deal with. Just some of the visuals to these different sets. A very common one is the dirt hole set there, where you have the footholds set back from a hole that you have dug and placed a bait in. Coyotes will come by, and of course, you'll cover that foothold trap back up. With a sifter pan and some of the other ground cover there, so it's not exposed. But they'll come back, smell the bait and lure and gland that you have around that dirt hole, and step into that foothold. A flat set is one that is just set in a more of a wide open area, like you see there. You might put some sort of visual attractant like a bone or some feathers, some scat even around that set, to where you can get the coyote to step on that pan and be trapped. Bobcats, just a little smaller foothold. You can't go up to a number 4 on these, but you see that number 2 to number 3. So what you're using for coyote could potentially also double serve as a bobcat foothold as well. Dirt hole sets do work for bobcats, flat sets as well. Cubby sets are very popular. That's the set you see there in that upper center picture. Visuals, they are a feline. They are very attracted to flashy things. Turkey feathers from past seasons, a duck wing, flashing CDs, even in some cases, the tape from old cassettes, something that gathers their attention to bring them to that trap site does really, really well. It is important to know that if you do plan to trap and sell bobcat fur, that they do need to be CITES tagged. That is a regulation we've got to follow. With both gray and red fox, you'll see a smaller foothold here, down to a 1.5 to a max of a number 2. That's for their own animal welfare. They are smaller and more fragile bone. We don't want to oversize the trap and cause undue harm, but very common to the same sets that you would for a coyote, just on a smaller scale trap. And as you've noticed here, a number 2 can work for a fox, bobcat, and coyote. So it's kind of a do-all size foothold trap for the generalist trapper. And these are some of the examples of visuals, like I mentioned. Flat sets, you can pound and stake down some old bones. Of course, save your turkey feathers, lots of utility there. And even as you go along and find old coyote scats, you can bag that up as a bit of a visual attractant to you and sprinkle some urine on there to increase the realism of your set and have a better chance of having that coyote settle down and step onto that foothold. Striped skunks can also be considered nest predators as well. They're omnivorous. They eat lots of different baits. Very not very picky of an animal to go ahead and set a foothold around with a little bit of bait in a dirt hole. They'll come by and check it out. They box trap very well. And then those smaller footholds, number 1 and 1.5, does well for spotted skunks. I'm sorry, striped skunks. Spotted skunks in the state of Alabama are a species of concern, and you have to release them. That's going to be a feat in itself, but you can of course call the local Game and Fish, the ADCNR, and let them know that you have a spotted skunk. They'll be very interested to know that, but just know that if you trap a spotted skunk, you cannot legally take that animal. He's got to be released. Crows are also a nest predator. I get questions about. Very difficult to manage a crow population. Folks tend to get pretty upset about the idea of them, but there's not much we can really do. Again, that's one we go back towards creating quality nesting cover. Unlike what we see here in this closed canopy hardwoods, you can imagine as a hen is up and off that nest, they become very visible to a crow, and they might come down and predate on some of those eggs in that case. But there's very limited things we can do outside of habitat in terms of, or outside of habitat to manage for crows. And feral hogs, like for most any other resource, are also a booger for wild turkey. In Alabama, they are considered a fur-bearing animal. It does allow, but we do still allow, trapping throughout the season. That's aimed at complete sounder removal using corral-style traps. The take home from this slide is just that with feral hog control, yes, they do cause mortality through nesting predation. That can be a major issue in some areas of the state. Not so much here in Northeast Alabama, but as you have a hog problem, don't educate your pigs. Start off on the right foot. Contact your extension office, and we'll be glad to share the proper resources and techniques for complete sounder removal or family group of hogs. That's the sows and the piglets. A big thing with trapping is you got to remember that it's your trap and it's your responsibility. You need to make sure that every trap is properly secured. Again, take time to learn the proper equipment, understand the soils you'll be trapping in, and make sure that you've got good quality equipment, chain, and cables, and that you're doing everything you can to secure that trap correctly. Animals walking around with traps on their feet and your expensive trap walking away are both a big negative. Animal welfare is an important part of trapping, and we don't need to have any more negative PR in the public eyes through improperly trapped or staked traps. And in the case of Alabama, you are also legally required to carry a live restraint device so that you can release non-target catch outside of season. You see the gray fox here. If we would trap that outside of the fur bear season, we are required to let that animal go. So you are required to carry a restraint pole as well. So predator management in summary, annual data is important to kind of understand where you're at in terms of hen to poult ratio and what kind of predators you're seeing on the landscape. We've talked about ways to gather some of that data. Predators may not be a significant issue on your property. Predator removal certainly works on a large scale, but also a consistent scale. But it can also work on a timed intensive removal as well. So just consider your goals, consider your legitimate commitment. Be honest with yourself, see what your neighbors are willing to do or not do, and just determine if it's a proper technique that you might be able to undertake. And again, habitat management very often is predator management. The better habitat we have out there can buffer a lot of mortality. Speaking of mortality, let's talk about some other sources here. Harvest, like we've already referenced, can be a big one. There are some situations where there are a significant amount of gobblers taken. You can imagine on public lands nowadays, as some of those pressures are increased, it can be a significant source of mortality. You really don't want it to be more than 30% to maintain a population. And again, you've seen some numbers prior to where they're much higher than that. Um, Illegal kill can be a problem as well. Anyone that wants to brag or take part in poaching needs to be reported on. Poaching can be a significant problem in some areas. And we talked about the Dr. Bueller and Dr. Harper study, they also examined the delayed harvest regulations that took place in Tennessee and found that it did not do anything in terms of impacting turkey populations. Uh, some of that was in line with potentially that, you know, with the pecking order and the concept of breeding and having these dominant toms on the landscape, these breeder toms on the landscape for a longer period would result in better recruitment to a population down the line that didn't take place, and they didn't find that to take place in that 7 year Tennessee study. And I mentioned prescribed fire several times already. I think it's important to discuss some of the maybe misconceptions and also, you know, realistic considerations to take place before you put fire on the landscape. So nesting season burns that, of course, take place from that April to June timeframe do have the potential to destroy not only the nest but also the nesting cover and potentially the brooding cover availability for later on in the year. And it can also just cause a hen to abandon a nest. Of course, if the vegetation is altered around her, whether her nest is destroyed or not, that can also make her get up and walk away and try that second or third nesting attempt. Um, the other issue with a growing season or a nesting season burn in that April to June timeframe is they can favor grasses and woody sprouts. Um, but if you do have to burn in this time frame, it's just important. This goes back to the rotational burning as well. You want to burn on compartments. Don't want to burn vast expanses of acreages at one time in the name of wildlife improvement. It's best to have multiple types of vegetation on the property at one time, and you do that through rotational burning. You know, rotating disturbance throughout the property does that. So just because you may have to do an April to June timeframe based on the vegetation response and the setback that you're requiring, you can conduct that. You just don't necessarily want to conduct it on a large scale. Now, late growing season burns in that July to November timeframe take place outside of the nesting season, can potentially allow you to maintain that brooding cover and not burn it up in the springtime when those poults are so and those nesting hens are so desperately seeking that cover. You could also increase your forb and insect availability burning at that time frame, decrease the woody sprouts, and not claim nests. So there's lots of benefits towards that later time frame growing season burn. And there's dormant season burning as well. That December to March timeframe provides benefits. You know, won't disrupt nesting, but it can, you know, limit the vegetation response or allow other things to, you know, persist that maybe you wouldn't want to, like those woody stems, like I keep referencing. So there's considerations and caveats towards the timing and frequency of burning, but when it comes to fire and nesting, essentially the less you can burn in the April to June timeframe, the better off you're going to be, and we can still provide some very good benefits towards prescribed fire burning in the late growing or the dormant season. Another mortality factor is, again, us as far as some of our land management practices. You know, in studies with again going back to the Dr. Bueller and Dr. Harper study, they found a 12% mowing mortality in areas that could be mowed. Other studies have found a range of that 10 to 12%. So, if at all possible, you know, don't be a mortality factor for for your hen turkeys. And, you know, again, nesting adult hens are extremely vital to a population, let alone when she and the nest are both mowed over. That's a double whammy. So try not to hay, mow, or bush hog any likely nesting area from April to May. And I've got on here too, or 200 days after peak rut. There are plenty of fawns that are also mowed over at this with this practice as well. So you've also got another option too. We understand that there are lands that need to be worked. There's cattle that needs to be fed. You know, we're we understand we have egg products out there, right? So you've also got an option too to scout your fields. If you see an area that a hen is frequently coming around April to May, she's by herself and up and around in the early morning or late afternoon hours, try to stay away from that area. You can also work the interiors of the fields and not off to the edges where those hens will usually be nested. Some of those, bottom corridors of some brushier, shrubbier cover, try to stay off of those a little ways, and then you won't be mowing over the hen and her nest. And ideally, try to put off mowing or haying until late June. That would be a better time. And these are some graphics as far as, kind of how to work some of these fields. You have the concept to just kind of go from the interior out instead of from the interior in. You can also mow on a grid starting in the center, going back and forth to the outer edge. And you can see in that graphic the dark green buffer. Don't mow or hay or bush hog all the way to the field edge. That's far more likely where the hens will be nesting. And if we have that practice, we can reduce some of that mowing mortality. Very common in some of the more Midwestern and Western states on some of their surveys and haying practices as well, to install these flushing bars on their tractors and their implements, to where they, as you move through the field, the chains that dangle down from these bars will roust and flush the nesting bird, whether it be a turkey or a duck or otherwise pheasants and things like that, to where you'll know as the operator to go around that area and hope that that nest, well, number one, the adult on that nest isn't destroyed, and that the nest isn't destroyed, and they've got a better opportunity to come back and rear those young. All right, moving on to virus and disease now, the last section of this presentation. There's four primary ones out here for turkeys that are highlighted. We have LPDV, or lymphoproliferative disease virus. The trouble with this disease is the vast majority of turkeys that have it appear completely healthy. Um, there are times where you can see some scabbed heads and legs, like you see in that upper right picture. But very often you'll see it as an indication with organ tumors and an enlarged spleen. An Alabama study that just completed in 2024 showed a 70% infection rate over 838 males that were analyzed. With in domestic flocks, the mortality is somewhere there around 15 to 25%. That sounds high, but if you've got to understand that in domestic flocks, of course, they're concentrated, to where it's likely, we don't have good estimates that I'm able to find right now in the literature, but it's likely that mortality rate is lower in wild turkey populations, just because they're not so concentrated and living on top of one another like you would in a domestic situation. Avian pox is another. This is one that is very commonly reported by hunters as they take toms or see sick turkeys in the field, because it's so easy to recognize that there's something wrong with this turkey. That turkey at the lower right there is exhibiting a substantial case of avian pox. It affects a lot of bird species. There's dry and wet forms. The dry form is what you're seeing there on the right-hand side with those lesions. The wet form is actually a respiratory lesions that affect the way that turkey breathes and functions throughout its upper respiratory tract. It's transmitted by mosquitoes, and also by direct transmission from bird to bird. They can also pick up this as they feed around and come in contact with other materials, fecal droppings and things like that. And it can live outside of the host for years. So as these infected animals are dropping um, um, infected materials on the landscape and heavily used food plots, bait sites, feed sites, and things like that, you can find that avian pox virus still in the landscape. And we're seeing about, in backyard flock situations, that mortality is about a 1 to 5%, which may be fairly close to wild turkey populations. Again, we have a hard time with getting a handle on the mortality rates in these wild populations. Two others are blackhead disease and coccidiosis. Blackhead spread through a fecal transmission. You'll see turkeys kind of hanging their wings and drooping down, or they'll have unkempt feathers, just look kind of um, unpreened and matted, just looking kind of rough, just lethargic, just overall just a sick looking bird. Um, Internally, you'll see, if you ever get into the body cavity cleaning turkeys, this is something to kind of keep an eye on. looking for a liver that is spotted, like you see in the upper right there. They get lesions on their internal organs, specifically the liver in the case of blackhead disease. And that same Alabama study I referenced earlier found a 0.7% infection rate in their birds in 2023. So fairly low infection rate. But the trouble with blackhead is it is a very, very high mortality rate, anywhere of above 70 to 75% in the literature. We do have a fairly decent handle on that. Coccidiosis is a digestive disease, very common in domestic flocks, and then also wild turkeys are susceptible as well. And it's spread through fecal transmission. So as droppings accumulate again in high use areas, you increase the risk of coccidiosis transmission. It's essentially just intestinal hemorrhaging. They've even found that uh, infected young male turkeys actually show lower iridescence if they're infected with coccidiosis. A pretty interesting finding, I thought. And then the rates vary all throughout the literature too. I've seen the study here from Illinois where 3% of those males were infected with coccidiosis to a 50% infection rate in southeastern poults. Poults and young turkeys are more susceptible towards mortality with coccidiosis than older birds. So that's another big downside of this virus and in the or this disease in the landscape is it can, and really any of these diseases really increase the risk of predation through disease as you have lower body condition um, and less energy and more stress. You increase the risk of predation, which even though these may not have a high mortality rate by the disease itself, that disease may lend towards higher predation. So, you know, a call I get fairly regularly throughout my career. It seems I say fairly regularly, annually anyway, is about raising and releasing wild turkeys, and that is a big no-no. It is a good way to release disease and virus as well into a population. You also run the risk of genetic pollution of wild flocks. Um, these turkeys that are releasing are poorly adapted towards wild survival. They will breed with wild turkeys and ultimately reduce the overall survival of wild birds. So we do not recommend to raise and release wild birds to the point to where it's even illegal in the majority of states. But going up to this central quote of this slide here, that the protozoan that causes blackhead, which is not uncommon in domestic flocks, can remain in the soil for 3 years. So you can imagine as a wild turkey or as a domestic population is released, you can see how disease transmission is a major concern. And if you see sick turkeys, or if you harvest a sick turkey or suspect a sick turkey, contact your local district DNR office. They would be glad to have that report and take that in and potentially even process some of those samples as well. So keep that in mind that as you see troubles, either alive, listless, sick looking turkey, or one that's in your hand from being harvested, feel free to report that. That's important information. All right, one last consideration here too, kind of goes back to disease, is in Alabama, we are allowed to bait for deer and feral hog in areas that are outside of our CWD zone. The major disadvantage of baiting, which is also an advantage of those that are trying to attract deer and feral hog, is that it congregates game and it draws in hogs for those properties that don't want feral hogs. That would be a disadvantage. So as you congregate game, disease transfer intuitively could potentially, increase. We mentioned earlier, these diseases are transferred by mosquitoes. Some of the materials these turkeys are dropping, their scabs, their fecal droppings, and also just from direct transmission. So anytime you're congregating turkeys artificially together through baiting and deer, you're increasing the potential for disease transfer and also for predation. Predators are routinely showing up to bait sites. That's well known. So consider your location. Are you pinning your turkeys down? Are they in a narrow area that doesn't allow much opportunity for escape? Or are you having a bait location in a far off area, like I showed earlier with those poults having to walk across a wide open landscape? Are they out there like a sitting duck, if you will? Are they on a death march? Consider your baiting location and some of that predation impact that you could be having, and nutritional impacts. Turkeys that are relying on grains, carbohydrates, and going to those heavily when they should otherwise be eating vegetation and insects that are high in protein. Carbohydrates are not protein, so you also have a nutritional consideration there as well that could be negatively impacting your flock. And are you feeding deer? Or are you actually attracting raccoons, which are a nest predator, right? Or hogs, which are another problem, and drawing in more potentially? I've got some anecdotal reports that, these property owners used to have hogs until their neighbors decided to bait heavily. And now they no longer have hogs because the hogs are all on the neighbors. That would be an example of a downside to placing bait, is attracting these other species you're trying to rid yourself of. Another big one is poorly stored grains. They are toxic. Mycotoxins, that being aflatoxin and fumonisin, they're fungal byproducts that will grow on stored grains, or moldy or humid grains that are remaining or fed out slow through a feeder like this. And birds, that being turkey and quail in the case of this presentation, but also small mammals, they are highly susceptible. Poults that feed on grains with this fungus do not do well. They do get sick and they die. Hens can have been seen to have lower fecundity as they feed on these toxins, and also just mortality in itself if they eat on enough of it. So, and it's not uncommon either, especially here in the Southeast. This is a study out of Texas where they examined 100 randomly bags of purchased deer corn, and 40% of those had illegal levels of aflatoxin on those products, and those that were high enough to cause some of the issues that I just discussed. So it's not an uncommon finding. And these are some pictures that I've taken, throughout my time in the woods. This is a feeder that, of course, is full of moldy, unusable feed. That would be a bad example. You would hate to have that fed to your wildlife. In that case, that needs cleaned out and not on site. It needs taken away and thrown away, not spread throughout the woods to be consumed. Same thing here, a feeder that was full of moldy corn that was just dumped out next to it. And if your corn is blue and white and purple and moldy like you see there, it is toxic. That needs to be taken off site, bagged up, and thrown away, not just broadcast into the woods to be fed upon. So those are examples of things we need to clean up and do better on. So reducing the risk of this type of contamination, you want to avoid feeding in warm and moist conditions. You don't want to put things in plastic bags to where it's sealed up and is sealing in that moisture and growing that fungal byproduct, that toxic byproduct. Avoid buying in bulk. Avoid storing for the long term. Really large capacity feeders that feed out slow are a good way to grow these aflatoxins and mycotoxins as well. You don't want to pour your bait into a pile on the ground to be rained on and grow mold as well. And you don't want to feed those feeds like I just talked about that are showing mold, or if they're clumped together, those are all indications of excessive moisture that can grow these toxins. So you want to feed when temps are below 60 degrees. Keep your grains in a cool and dry place, and clean out your uneaten feed. Don't just broadcast it, sack it up, and take it out of the woods with you. And if you're having a feeder that's causing a lot of trouble, take the time to fix and clean and repair that feeder. Caulk it back up to where it's not leaking anymore, and you're keeping the moisture and rain out of that feeder, and keeping your feed as in good a condition as you possibly can. All right, so wrapping up, I think, as we went through this presentation, as you ask yourself, why am I seeing more or less turkey? You take into account some of these things that we've talked about and begin to think about how you can apply some of these strategies and considerations to your own land. And one last message that I do want to wrap up with, I've talked about a lot of referenced about adjoining properties and working with neighbors and what's going on some of the adjoining lands. We do have a publication on our extension website of forming a hunting cooperative. This is a growing concept. It's been popular in the Northeast and has been trickling down through the Midwest for years, and we're beginning to see several more of these pop up in the Southeast. But it's essentially an idea of working together on a common goal, whether it be deer management, turkey management, or just wildlife, game management as a whole. Coming together, kind of having a handshake agreement to manage in somewhat of a similar way, and to share some workload and efforts. I mentioned prescribed burning. I've mentioned the trapping. The more that you can, have a partner in neighboring lands and improve at a landscape level instead of just on a local level, that's where you really begin to see the impacts of these land management practices and predator management practices that we've talked about today. So please visit our website and have a look at that publication, and maybe considering sharing that with your neighbors, and moving forward with forming a hunting cooperative. There's lots of resources out there. Of course, Alabama and UT Extension are two of those, other states as well. We have a website online. We have YouTube videos online, Facebook pages. The state forestry commissions are a good resource. Department of Conservation, Wildlife and Freshwater Fisheries, and both also TWRA in Tennessee, great resources for management and advice. Lots of other private entities out there as well that you can call on for information. On our webpage, you can find us and some of our resources at aces.edu. We have a search box up there. That's a great way to find that forming a hunting cooperative article. Our directory, you'll see our counties all broken down there. As you click on those, you'll find the staff that serve your area. You can also follow us on social media. Our county offices also have newsletters to keep up with our events. This is an example of our Facebook page. If you'll search ACES, Forestry, Wildlife, and Natural Resources, you'll see that come up, and feel free to follow us, or at least check in every now and then to learn about some of the events and happenings that are taking place across the state. As mentioning with ADCNR and TWRA, there are private lands biologists out there. As you visit their websites, you can find these directories to contact those that serve your area as well. And also lots of other resources related towards wild turkey management and regulation, and reports on those state game agency web pages. In terms of trapping, you've got all types of local, both national and state associations. In terms of learning how to trap, it's great to shadow and follow an ethical, experienced trapper. YouTube and internet forums can be a good place. You just have to understand that anybody can post online, right? And also lots of other publications and magazines that are specific to trapping too. So this is my contact information. I greatly appreciate y'all tuning in for today's presentation. If I can ever help you with any other questions related towards this presentation or wildlife and natural resources management, please feel free to reach out.